Jack Thompson wasn't the kind of guy who liked drama. After years of working in a high-pressure tech job, he'd finally decided to trade his suit and tie for flannel shirts and hiking boots. He bought a cabin deep in the woods of rural Montana, a place where cell signals were weak, neighbors were non-existent, and life moved at the pace of rustling leaves. It was supposed to be his escape from the chaos of city life, a personal sanctuary where he could breathe easy and recharge. At first, everything was perfect. The air smelled fresh, the stars shone brighter than he'd ever seen them before, and the only sounds that filled his days were birds chirping and wind whispering through the trees. Jack spent most mornings sipping coffee on his porch, watching deer wander across his property. Sometimes friends would visit for weekends, bringing along guitars or board games. They'd sit by the fire pit, laughing until their sides hurt, while the world outside faded into nothingness. But no matter how remote your hideaway is, trouble always finds a way to knock on your door, sometimes literally. In Jack's case, the trouble came wrapped in a neatly pressed blouse, oversized sunglasses, and an attitude sharp enough to cut glass. Her name? Karen Miller. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the head of the local homeowners association, HOA, a position she wore like a crown. To say Karen took her role seriously would be an understatement. She lived for rules, the kind that made people roll their eyes but rarely argue about, like whether mailboxes should match or if holiday decorations needed pre-approval. When Karen first noticed Jack's cabin, it wasn't because of anything particularly unusual. At least, not at first. His windows didn't have the approved type of shutters listed in the HOA guidelines. Technically, this violated the aesthetic standards of the community. So, true to form, Karen sent him a letter, then another, and another. Each one grew more aggressive, accusing Jack of ruining the neighborhood's charm and demanding immediate compliance. Jack, however, had zero interest in playing along. He figured the whole thing was ridiculous. Who cared about window shutters out here in the middle of nowhere? Besides, he barely interacted with anyone else around. This was supposed to be his space, free from judgment and nitpicking. So he ignored the letters, tossing them into the trash without a second thought. Karen, predictably, did not take kindly to being dismissed. If anything, it fueled her determination. What started as polite reminders soon turned into thinly veiled threats. She began showing up unannounced, knocking on his door during dinner or early Saturday mornings when all Jack wanted was to sleep in. Every time, she brought up the same complaints. The shutters, the occasional weekend guests, the fact that his woodpile wasn't stacked neatly enough. Jack tried to stay calm, explaining that he didn't see the point of obsessing over such trivial things. But Karen wasn't interested in reason. In her mind, rules were rules, and breaking them, even in small ways, was practically criminal. What Jack didn't realize was that Karen's fixation on his cabin went beyond mere aesthetics. Over time, she started inventing reasons to justify her anger. She told other members of the HOA that Jack was suspicious, claiming she'd seen strange vehicles coming and going late at night. To her, this was proof that something shady was happening. Never mind that those strange vehicles belonged to old college buddies visiting for a fishing trip or delivery trucks dropping off groceries. In Karen's version of events, Jack was running some sort of illegal operation right under everyone's noses. Her paranoia reached new heights when she swore she spotted men dressed in dark clothes entering the property after sunset. Sure, these figures might have been shadows, cast by tree branches swaying in the moonlight, or maybe even raccoons rummaging through the trash, but Karen wasn't about to let logic get in the way of her story. Convinced she was onto something big, she began spreading rumors throughout the community. Before long, whispers about Jack's supposed misdeeds echoed louder than the sound of crickets on a summer evening. What Karen failed to grasp, though, was that there were strangers frequenting Jack's cabin, but not for the reasons she imagined. Unbeknownst to her, the FBI had quietly approached Jack months earlier, asking if they could use his secluded home as a temporary safe house for an ongoing investigation. Given its remote location and lack of prying eyes, the cabin was ideal. For their purposes, Jack agreed, trusting that the agents knew what they were doing. Since then, undercover operatives had been using the space to monitor communications linked to a dangerous drug cartel operating nearby. Their presence was discreet, almost invisible, unless you knew exactly what to look for. So while Karen spun tales of crime lords and illicit activities, the reality was far less scandalous and much more serious. Inside Jack's cozy little retreat, highly trained federal agents worked tirelessly to dismantle a network responsible for flooding cities with drugs and violence. None of them expected their cover to be blown out by rival criminals anyway. But as Karen continued down her crusade against Jack, she unknowingly set the stage for a confrontation unlike anything anyone involved could have anticipated. For now, though, Jack remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his front porch. All he wanted was peace and quiet, two things that seemed increasingly out of reach thanks to Karen's relentless campaign. Little did he know, the worst was yet to come, and it would arrive in the form of fake cops flashing lights and gunfire echoing through the forest. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. Once she got an idea in her head, it stuck there like gum on a shoe. And right now, the idea that Jack's cabin was some kind of criminal hotspot had taken root deep in her mind. Every time she drove past his property, she'd squint through her oversized sunglasses, convinced she saw something suspicious, a shadow moving behind the curtains, tire tracks in the dirt driveway, or even just a light left on late at night. To Karen, these weren't innocent details. They were pieces of evidence proving her theory correct. Her frustration boiled over one afternoon when yet another letter she'd sent to Jack came back unanswered. This wasn't just about window shutters anymore, it was personal. In her eyes, Jack wasn't just breaking the rules. He was disrespecting her. How dare he ignore her authority? She was the HOA president, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's integrity. If she said there was trouble brewing at Jack's place, then by golly, there was trouble brewing. But Karen wasn't content to sit around and wait for someone else to fix the problem. No, she wanted action and fast. So she did what any overly zealous, slightly unhinged person might do. She took matters into her own hands. After doing some online research and ignoring all the red flags, she hired a private security firm to investigate Jack's cabin. The company billed itself as Elite Tactical Enforcement Specialists, which sounded official enough to impress Karen. What she didn't realize, or maybe chose to overlook, was that this wasn't a legitimate law enforcement agency. These guys were more like wannabe cops, the kind who wore knockoff uniforms and carried fake badges while dreaming of playing hero. The plan was simple, or so Karen thought. The fake cops would storm the cabin under the guise of a police raid, claiming they had a search warrant based on suspicions of illegal activity. They'd break down the door, ransack the place, and hopefully catch Jack red-handed doing, well, whatever it was Karen imagined he was doing. Maybe they'd find drugs, stolen goods, or secret documents. Or maybe they'd just scare him enough to make him pack up and leave town. Either way, Karen figured she'd come out on top. Her reputation as the ultimate rule enforcer would be restored, and Jack would finally learn his lesson. What Karen didn't know, because she hadn't bothered to ask, was that the men she hired weren't exactly professionals. Sure, they looked tough in their tactical gear and mirrored sunglasses, but their experience was limited to low-stakes gigs like repo work and bouncer duty. They weren't trained for real-life combat situations, let alone dealing with federal agents armed to the teeth. But none of that mattered to Karen. As far as she was concerned, they were her ticket to justice. Meanwhile, inside Jack's cabin, life continued as usual, or as close to usual as it could get, with undercover FBI agents using the space as a temporary command center. The agents had been working tirelessly for weeks, monitoring encrypted messages tied to a powerful drug cartel. Their operation was delicate, requiring absolute secrecy and precision. Every move they made was calculated, every piece of equipment strategically placed. Cameras were hidden in the trees surrounding the property, motion sensors lined the perimeter, and backup plans were mapped out in case things went sideways. Jack himself tried to stay out of the way. He knew better than to ask too many questions or interfere with the agent's work. All he cared about was keeping his head down and hoping the whole thing would blow over soon. Still, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. The agents had warned him that their cover could be compromised at any moment, though they assured him they were prepared for anything. If anyone tries to breach the property without permission, one of them had said, "We'll handle it." That phrase, "we'll handle it," stuck in Jack's mind. It sounded reassuring at first, but the more he thought about it, the more ominous it felt. Handle it how? With words? Handshakes? Or something worse? He pushed the thought aside, telling himself not to borrow trouble. After all, who would even think to raid his cabin? It was miles away from civilization, tucked into the woods where no one ever ventured unless invited. The chances of someone randomly stumbling upon the place seemed slim to none. As the days passed, the agents grew increasingly focused. They spent hours hunched over laptops, deciphering coded messages and tracking the movements of their targets. Occasionally, they'd step outside to test the security measures they'd installed: cameras, tripwires, and other gadgets designed to alert them to intruders. Everything was running smoothly, almost eerily so. The quiet of the forest gave the illusion of safety, lulling everyone into a false sense of security. Back in town, Karen was growing impatient. She'd paid good money for results, and so far, nothing had happened. The fake cops promised her they'd act quickly, but delays kept cropping up. Equipment malfunctions, scheduling conflicts, weather concerns, it was always something. Each excuse grated on Karen's nerves, fueling her impatience. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they gave her a date and time: midnight, 2 nights from now. That was when the raid would happen. Karen practically vibrated with excitement as she marked the date on her calendar. She imagined the scene unfolding perfectly, the fake cops bursting in, catching Jack off guard, dragging him out in handcuffs while she watched triumphantly from afar. She pictured the look of shock on his face, the vindication she'd feel as the community praised her for exposing a dangerous criminal. It was going to be glorious. What Karen failed to consider, however, was the reality waiting inside Jack's cabin. The FBI agents weren't amateurs. They were highly trained professionals prepared for worst-case scenarios. Their training included identifying imposters, neutralizing threats, and protecting their cover at all costs. When the fake cops arrived, guns drawn and shouting commands, they wouldn't be met with confusion or panic. Instead, they'd walk straight into a trap, one that would leave them scrambling for answers. Assuming they survived the encounter at all. For now, though, Karen remained blissfully unaware of the disaster looming on the horizon. She clung to her fantasy of victory, oblivious to the fact that her reckless actions were about to unleash chaos far beyond anything she could have imagined. It was the kind of night that seemed tailor-made for trouble. The sky was pitch black, with no moon to cast even a sliver of light over the dense Montana woods. A cold wind swept through the trees, rustling leaves and sending shivers down anyone brave or foolish enough to be out in such conditions. For Jack Thompson, tucked away in his cabin, it was just another quiet evening. He'd made himself a cup of tea, settled into his favorite chair by the fire, and tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something wasn't quite right. Unbeknownst to him, a convoy of vehicles had been creeping along. The forest roads for hours, their headlights turned off to avoid detection. The fake cops Curran had hired were finally making their move. They parked far enough away from the cabin to avoid raising suspicion, then suited up in tactical gear designed to look like real police uniforms. Armed with weapons and fake badges, they approached the property on foot, moving silently through the darkness. Their leader, a burly guy with a shaved head and a permanent scowl, gave hand signals to his team as they fanned out around the perimeter. Inside the cabin, the FBI agents were already on high alert. Earlier that evening, one of their motion sensors had picked up movement near the edge of the property. At first, they thought it might be an animal, a deer or perhaps a bear, but when multiple sensors triggered simultaneously, they knew better. Someone was out there, and whoever it was, they weren't here for a friendly visit. The agents exchanged tense glances but didn't say a word. They'd trained for moments like this, and their instincts kicked into overdrive as the fake cops. Closed in, they felt confident. This was going to be easy, they thought. Just bust in, ransack the place, and make it look like a legitimate raid. They had no idea what or who they were dealing with. When the leader of the group reached the PC front door, he raised a battering ram and slammed it against the wood frame. The sound echoed through the forest like a gunshot, shattering the silence. The moment the door gave way, all hell broke loose. Bright lights flashed inside the cabin, illuminating every corner. Alarms blared at ear-splitting volumes, and within seconds, the fake cops found themselves staring down the barrels of several firearms held by men and women who looked anything but amateur. The FBI agents emerged from hidden positions, their guns drawn and aimed directly at the intruders. "Drop your weapons," one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Hands where we can see them." For a split second, the fake cops froze, unsure of what to do. Were these real cops? Federal agents? Or just some overzealous homeowners protecting their turf? Whatever the case, it was clear they were outmatched. One of the imposters panicked and fired a shot into the air, hoping to create confusion. Big mistake. The agents responded instantly, returning fire with precision and discipline. Bullets whizzed past, hitting walls and sending splinters flying. Chaos erupted as the fake cops scrambled to retreat, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Outside, Karen sat in her car, parked a safe distance away. She'd come to watch the spectacle unfold, convinced she was about to witness justice served. But instead of seeing Jack dragged out in handcuffs, she saw flashes of gunfire and heard shouts echoing through the trees. Her heart sank as reality hit her like a freight train. Something had gone horribly wrong. Panicked, she started her car and sped off, leaving tire tracks in the dirt road behind her. As she drove, her mind raced. What had she done? Who were those people? And why did it feel like her entire world was crashing down around her? Back at the cabin, the situation quickly came under control. The FBI agents methodically secured the area, ensuring none of the intruders could regroup or counterattack. Two of the fake cops lay wounded on the ground, clutching injuries sustained during the exchange of gunfire. The rest had fled into the woods, abandoning their weapons and gear in their desperation to get away. It was a textbook example of how not to execute a raid and a stark reminder of why amateurs should never try to play soldier. Once the immediate threat was neutralized, the agents turned their attention to damage control. They contacted local law enforcement, explaining the situation and requesting backup. Within minutes, police cruisers and unmarked vehicles began arriving on the scene, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. Officers swarmed the property, securing evidence and rounding up the remaining intruders. Meanwhile, forensic teams combed through the wreckage left behind by the botched raid, collecting fingerprints, bullet casings, and scraps of clothing that would later help piece together exactly what had happened. Jack, meanwhile, stood in stunned silence, watching the whirlwind of activity unfold around him. His once peaceful cabin now resembled a war zone, with broken furniture, shattered windows, and spent shell casings scattered across the floor. He couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. These weren't ordinary criminals who'd broken in. They were imposters dressed as cops, armed to the teeth and ready to shoot first and ask questions later. And somehow, the FBI agent stationed in his home had managed to stop them before things spiraled completely out of control. One of the agents approached Jack, his expression calm but serious. "You okay?" he asked, lowering his weapon slightly. Jack nodded, though his hands were still trembling. What just happened?" he stammered, struggling to process everything. The agent sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Looks like someone sent a group of fake cops to raid your place," he explained. "We're not sure who yet, but trust me, we'll find out." As dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale golden glow over the forest, the full scope of the nights, events began to sink in. What had started as a reckless attempt by Karen to assert her authority had escalated into a violent confrontation that could have ended much worse. The fake cops' plan had unraveled spectacularly, exposing their lack of training and preparation. And Karen, sitting alone in her house miles away, realized too late that she'd bitten off far more than she could chew. For Jack, the experience was surreal. He'd moved to the woods to escape drama and live a simple life, only to find himself caught in the crossfire of a bizarre and dangerous situation. Yet despite the chaos, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Thanks to the FBI agent's quick thinking and professionalism, the worst had been avoided. Now, all that remained was figuring out who was behind the attack and holding them accountable for their actions. Little did Jack know, the answers wouldn't be hard to find. Back at the scene of the raid, investigators discovered a crucial piece of evidence: a rental car abandoned near the edge of the property. Inside, they found papers linking the vehicle to Karen Miller. It didn't take long for authorities to connect the dots. By the time the sun rose fully over the treetops, Karen's name was already at the top of their list of suspects. By the time the sun fully rose over the Montana wilderness, the cabin's front yard looked like the set of an action movie. Broken glass littered the ground, bullet casings glinted in the morning light, and the remnants of what had been a peaceful retreat now stood as a testament to chaos. Police tape cordoned off the area, and reporters began arriving in droves, eager to get a scoop on the bizarre events that had unfolded overnight. Neighbors who rarely ventured beyond their own driveways were suddenly out in force, whispering among themselves about what could have possibly happened. For Jack, the hours after the raid felt surreal. He was questioned by investigators, his words recorded as they pieced together the timeline of events. At first, he struggled to explain everything clearly, how he'd gone from living a quiet life in the woods to being caught in the middle of a violent confrontation. But as he recounted the story, his voice steadied. The agents assured him they'd protect him and help clean up the mess. They also promised to compensate him for the damage done to his property, though Jack knew no amount of money could truly make up for the invasion of his sanctuary. Meanwhile, the FBI worked tirelessly to identify the perpetrators. Evidence collected at the scene painted a damning picture. Fingerprints lifted from abandoned weapons, matched those of known mercenaries and low-level enforcers often hired for shady operations. Then there was the rental car found near the edge of the property. Inside, investigators discovered receipts, documents, and even a crumpled parking ticket that led them straight to Karen Miller. It didn't take long for law enforcement to put two and two together. When officers arrived at Karen's house later that day, she was pacing frantically in her living room, clutching a cup of coffee gone cold. She'd barely slept, replaying the events of the previous night in her head. Every sound outside, the crunch of tires on gravel, the distant bark of a dog sent her heart racing. When the knock came at her door, she hesitated before answering, hoping against hope that it wasn't who she thought it was. But when she opened the door and saw the stern faces of detectives standing there, her stomach dropped. "Karen Miller?" one of them asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded weakly, stepping aside to let them in. For the next several hours, she sat at her kitchen table, squirming under the weight of their questions. At first, she tried to play dumb, pretending she had no idea why they were there. But as the evidence piled up, the rental car contract in her name, phone records showing calls to the private security firm, even text messages discussing plans for the raid, her defenses crumbled. By the end of the interrogation, she was sobbing, claiming she'd only wanted to do the right thing and protect her community. The fallout was swift and merciless. News outlets picked up the story, turning Karen into a national laughingstock. Headlines mocked her obsession with HOA rules and her ill-fated attempt to take matters into her own hands. Social media exploded with memes and jokes, dubbing her HOA Karen and immortalizing her face alongside cartoonish depictions of fake cops storming cabins. Even her former allies in the HOA distanced themselves, embarrassed by her actions and fearful of being associated with her downfall. Facing multiple charges including conspiracy, impersonation of law enforcement, and obstruction of justice, Karen's life unraveled almost overnight. Her once immaculate home fell into disarray as she spent countless hours consulting lawyers and preparing for court. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided her gaze, and strangers openly gawked whenever she ventured out in public. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist was now a pariah, reduced to attending court-mandated anger management classes and performing community service. For Jack, watching Karen's fall from grace was both satisfying and sobering. On one hand, he couldn't deny feeling a sense of vindication. After months of harassment and baseless accusations, she'd finally gotten what was coming to her. But on the other hand, he couldn't help but feel sorry for her. Her actions had been reckless and misguided, yes, but they stemmed from a place of insecurity and desperation, a need to control something in a world that often felt uncontrollable. Still, sympathy only went so far. Jack knew he couldn't stay in the cabin, not after everything that had happened. The memories of the raid would haunt him every time he walked through the door. With the FBI's blessing, he decided to start fresh. He sold the cabin and used the proceeds to buy a smaller, more secluded property deeper in the woods. This time, he made sure it was miles away from any HOA jurisdiction. He kept the new location a secret, sharing it only with close friends and family. As he settled into his new home, he reflected on the lessons he'd learned. Life in the wilderness wasn't just about escaping people, it was about finding balance, respecting boundaries, and choosing your battles wisely. In the months that followed, Jack became an advocate for others who had faced similar struggles with overzealous HOAs. He joined online forums, shared his story at community meetings, and even consulted with lawmakers about reforming outdated regulations. His goal wasn't revenge or fame. It was simply to ensure that no one else had to endure what he had. Though he still preferred solitude, he realized that sometimes speaking out was necessary to create change. As for Karen, her punishment extended far beyond legal consequences. Stripped of her title as HOA president and ostracized by the very community she had sought to protect, she retreated into isolation. Some said she spent her days obsessively Googling herself, reading articles and comments about her infamous blunder. Others claimed she became a recluse, rarely leaving her house except to fulfill her court-ordered obligations. Whether she truly learned from her mistakes remained unclear. What was certain, however, was that her name would forever be linked to one of the most absurd and self-destructive episodes anyone in the area had ever seen. Back at the original cabin site, nature slowly reclaimed its territory. Grass grew over the tire tracks left by fleeing imposters, and wildflowers sprouted where blood had spilled. Birds returned to nest in the trees, and deer wandered freely across the land. The scars of the raid faded with time, leaving behind only faint reminders of the drama that had unfolded. For Jack, the experience served as a powerful reminder of resilience and proof that sometimes karma works in mysterious ways. Months had passed since the raid, and life in the quiet Montana woods began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The forest healed itself, as it always did, erasing the scars left behind by human chaos. Wildflowers bloomed where boots had trampled. The earth and birdsong replaced the echoes of gunfire. For Jack Thompson, though, moving forward wasn't as simple as letting nature take its course. The events of that night lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He'd survived something extraordinary, something most people would never experience in their lifetimes, but survival came with a cost. Jack's new cabin was tucked even deeper into the wilderness than the last one, miles away from any prying eyes or nosy neighbors. It was smaller, humbler, and built with practicality in mind rather than luxury. There were no fancy shutters here, no decorative touches that might catch the attention of an overzealous HOA board. Just sturdy walls, a reliable roof, and enough space for him to breathe easy again. He spent his days fixing up the place, chopping wood, and tending to a small garden he'd started near the edge of the property. Life was simpler now, quieter, but not without its challenges. The biggest challenge wasn't physical, it was emotional. Jack found himself replaying the raid in his head late at night when sleep refused to come. He'd hear the crash of the battering ram against the door, see the flash of lights, and feel the adrenaline surge all over again. Sometimes he wondered if things could have gone differently if the FBI hadn't been there, if the fake cops had succeeded in their mission, or worse, if someone had gotten seriously hurt. Those thoughts haunted him, but they also taught him something valuable: gratitude. Every sunrise felt like a gift now. Every moment of peace a hard-won victory. To cope, Jack threw himself into advocacy work. He joined online groups dedicated to helping victims of HOA abuse, sharing his story and offering advice to others who felt trapped in similar situations. At first, he hesitated to speak publicly about what had happened. He didn't want to relive the trauma or attract unwanted attention. But the more he talked, the more he realized how many people needed to hear his story. Countless others had dealt with bullying, harassment, or legal threats from overzealous HOAs, and knowing they weren't alone gave them strength to fight back. Jack became a voice for change, pushing for reforms that would protect homeowners from unchecked power. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Local news outlets picked up on his advocacy work, interviewing him for segments about HOA reform. Community leaders invited him to speak at town hall meetings where he shared insights about the dangers of allowing personal vendettas to masquerade as community service. His message was clear: rules are important, but so is compassion. No one should have to live in fear because someone else decided to play judge, jury, and executioner. For Karen Miller, redemption, or at least acceptance, proved far harder to achieve. Her court case dragged on for months, each hearing bringing Fresh humiliation as details of her botched raid made headlines. She pleaded guilty to several charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, which included probation, mandatory counseling, and hundreds of hours of community service. But the punishment that stung the most wasn't handed down by a judge. It was the loss of respect from those around her. Friends stopped inviting her to gatherings, acquaintances avoided eye contact, and strangers whispered behind her back whenever she ventured out in public. Karen tried to rebuild her life, but the weight of her mistakes pressed heavily on her shoulders. She sold her home and moved to a modest apartment in a nearby town, hoping to escape the judgmental stares and snide remarks. During her community service assignments, she scrubbed graffiti off walls, cleaned parks, and sorted donations at food banks, all tasks meant to teach her humility and accountability. Some days, she approached these chores with genuine effort, determined to prove she could be better. Other days, bitterness consumed her, and she muttered under her breath about how unfair everything was. Over time, Karen began to reflect on her actions, or at least, that's what she told her therapist. In sessions, she admitted feeling powerless before the raid, convinced that enforcing rules was the only way to maintain order. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said during one particularly raw session. "But looking back, I can see how wrong I was. I let my ego get in the way." Whether this newfound self-awareness translated into real change remained to be seen. Some believed she deserved a second chance. Others thought she'd burned too many bridges to ever earn forgiveness. Back in the neighborhood, life went on without her. New members joined the HOA board, bringing fresh perspectives and less rigid attitudes. Rules were relaxed, and disputes were handled with conversation rather than confrontation. The community began to heal, slowly but surely, learning from the mistakes of the past. Jack's old cabin changed hands multiple times before finally being purchased by a young family who loved its rustic charm and remote location. They painted the shutters bright blue, hung wind chimes from the porch, and filled the yard with laughter and light. For Jack, closure came not from seeing justice served or watching Karen's downfall, but from finding purpose in the aftermath. He realized that while he couldn't control what others did, he could choose how to respond. By using his experience to help others, he turned a nightmare into a lesson, a reminder that resilience often grows from adversity. And though he still preferred solitude, he knew he wasn't truly alone. The friendships he'd forged through advocacy, the support he'd received from strangers turned allies, and the quiet beauty of the forest surrounding him reminded him daily that life, despite its challenges, was worth fighting for. As winter approached, snow blanketed the landscape, muffling sound and softening edges. Jack stood on the porch of his new cabin, sipping coffee and watching steam rise from his mug. The air smelled crisp and clean, and the world seemed impossibly still. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely yet somehow comforting sound. Jack smiled faintly, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be learned from. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and snow, he knew he'd found exactly what he'd been searching for all along: balance. Life wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And sometimes that was all anyone could ask for.